All right, good morning. Wow. Week 11 of the Walk-Thru, can you believe it? We have 2 more weeks left, so don't fall asleep. You only have 2 more weeks before the exam, so you got to get this down, right? All right, you guys chuckle, but, wait. Okay. All right, and I do want to give a plug for the videos. If you haven't seen them, if you go on to the website, you can link right in and you can review it. So if you missed a week, go ahead and see it. If some people, are away and, you have some relatives or some friends away that want to see it, you can let them know and they can view it. We have some friends who have viewed it. And Nate's always pretty good and funny on his little vignettes. He's got another one this morning. You can see his lamp up here. He tells me that is an oil lamp. It's just very efficient. So, all right, so let's get started. First 11 chapters of Genesis, we'll walk through real quick, right? So we've got the creation and the fall and the flood and nations, all right? First 11 chapters. Then we're going to go over here across the Red Sea, the Sinai Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, and Ur of Chaldees. Here we have the Tigris and Euphrates, and then we dip our finger in salt. All right. And then up the Euphrates to a place called Haran. And Haran is barren, like Sarah. LSB, seed, blessing. All right, Terah dies. And I'm going to take a shortcut here. Excuse me. Over towards the promised land, right? And we have Abraham who has 2 sons, 2 eyes, they are Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac has 2 sons, J and E, Jacob and Esau, smooth and hairy. Jacob has 12 sons, right? And 1 daughter, Dinah. All right. The one we're interested in, coat of many colors, Joseph sold into slavery down to Egypt, where he works for a guy named who? Potiphar. Thrown in jail, rises, second in command, the vizier. Israel comes down, Joseph dies, and then 400 years of bondage. At the end, we have a mighty deliverer who is Moses. Let my people go, Pharaoh says. No, 10 plagues across the Red Sea. Again, back to the Sinai Peninsula, right, to Mount Sinai. Here, they receive 2 things. Remember what they were? The law and the instructions for the tabernacle, okay? Then we come up to Katie's barn, and we send out how many spies? 12, the earlobes, right? 12 spies. 10 say, no. 2 say, go. The 2? Joshua and Caleb. Everyone 20 and older, they die out after wanderings. We end up on the east side of the Jordan River, right near Mount Nebo, okay? Moses delivers sermons in the book of Deuteronomy. Moses dies. A new general is raised up, right? General Joshua. Joshua crosses with the Israelites the Jordan River into the promised land, and he fits the battle of Jericho, and then Ai. They go south and north, and then he divides the land among the tribes. Okay? And then what happens? You can see over here, 400 years of dark ages or judges, right? So that we have judges. The last judge, the first prophet, is Samuel. Samuel anoints 3 kings. And 3 kings are? You can cheat. You can look at the wall if you need to. Everyone's kind of like out of the corner of my eye. I can get that one. Saul, David, and Solomon, right? We said no heart, full heart, half heart. At the end of which, the bombs, boom. The kingdom divides. It divides over taxes. And I want you to remember the bomb because up north you have a guy named who? Jerry. And down south, Ray. So Jerry bomb, Ray bomb. Or Rehoboam, Jeroboam. Okay? And we have a divided kingdom. In the north, 19 kings. How many good? 19 and 0. Right? In the south, we have 19 kings, 1 queen. And How many good ones? 8, right? At the end of the northern kingdoms, the 19 kings, Assyria comes in, gives them the boot, 722 BC. On the southern kingdom, it lasts all the way down to 586 BC. Although the first deportation happened in 605 BC, that's when Daniel was taken with all of his friends, the best of the best, taken into exile. Then there is 70 years of exile, and that's where we end today. All right? After all of those bad kings, it's kind of refreshing to see Daniel and his friends in exile because they stood for God. You remember Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, right? Anyone know their Hebrew names? Jim? Hananiah. Yeah. Everyone knows Daniel, and Daniel's, but his Babylonian name was Belteshazzar, right? And then the reason Nebuchadnezzar probably changed it because all 4 of those guys, their names had God in it, their Hebrew God. Their names had meaning. He changed their names to align with the Babylonian gods. Yet even though they had Babylonian God names, they didn't walk that way. And you see, one day I want to ask, and I don't know if anyone here knows, but when they were thrown in the fiery furnace, there was a 4th figure walking with them that amazed Nebuchadnezzar. All right, he says, one like a god. And I don't know what they talked about, but it would have been surely interesting to see what that 4th guy talked to those 3 people about. But the cool thing is even in the midst of a nation that did not recognize Jehovah as God, those 4 men stood up for it, and they made a difference in their community. So all through history, you see God with faithful men who have preserved a remnant, and that's the whole theme as you come, because next week we're going to talk about the return after 70 years back to the land that was promised. And if you want to, the 70 years, Jeremiah talks about that. Daniel, the cool thing about Daniel is he had the best vision ever. He got to see the end. He got to see Messiah. And he's promised that he will not be there when that happens, but God will raise him up, and he will get his allotted portion at that time. So that's a cool story. All right? So this morning, we have another guest from that period, the scribe of Jeremiah.
You know, I don't think that anyone else has ever read this stuff. No one. We have pages and pages and pages of holy prophecy, words from the mind of God himself, and no audience. You know what? I take that back. Someone did read these once. A king, actually, Jehoiakim, king of Judah. I watched him do it. Every word on every page. And then I watched him take his knife, and after reading every page, he would cut it, and he would place it into the fire pot that was burning next to his throne to be destroyed. Every single page. And he was just laughing and smirking the whole time he was doing it, as if it was the most hilarious joke that he'd ever planned to mock the prophet and mock the imaginary God that he claimed to represent. You know, more than any other scene, that episode with King Jehoiakim burning the scroll of holy prophecy just sums up Jeremiah's life and his ministry. Unheard words, unread pages, and unchanged hearts. That's the fruit of Jeremiah's ministry. And now he's dead. And I think that I might be the only person alive who actually misses him. It's kind of funny how Jeremiah and I first met. It wasn't his idea. It wasn't my idea either. It was God's idea, actually. God had told Jeremiah that he needed to get all of his prophecies written down. So he commanded him to hire a scribe. I was young. I was unemployed. I could write, so Jeremiah hired me. And for hours, for days, he would dictate, and I would write. And that's how you got all these pages that you see here in front of me. All these unread pages. You know, I always had the sense that as I was writing for Jeremiah, that we were doing something monumental. You know, writing these words that could change the course of nations. I mean, Jeremiah was called to be the mouthpiece of the Most High God, the ruler of the universe. I thought for sure we would have the ears of kings and queens and peasants alike, and that everyone would give us the honor, the glory, the recognition that our office deserved. I thought that Jeremiah was my ticket to a good life, to a notable life, to a blessed life. You know, I was actually just reading this letter just last night that I had written years ago, but had me thinking along those lines. It's a letter that Jeremiah wrote to the exiles, those Jews who used to live here in Jerusalem, but were taken to the land of Babylon as prisoners. And Jeremiah wrote them this letter, and this is what he said. He said, "For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future." Now that sounds like my definition of a good life. That's the life that I thought I was going to get by being associated with Jeremiah. I mean, my name, Baruch, means bless. It's like I was destined from birth to have this amazing life. But when everything fell apart for Jeremiah, everything fell apart for me too. And why is it that the guy who wrote this letter about those great plans and prosperity, why is it that he had a life that looked nothing like that picture? You know, as you look through these pages over here, as you look through all of Jeremiah's writings, his prophecy, his life, what you see is, you see a portrait of human misery. Jeremiah was called to be a prophet when he was still a young man. He was actually still living with his parents at the time. And shortly right after that, God told Jeremiah that he would never marry, that he would live a celibate life as a testimony to the rest of Israel of God's coming judgment. A life without sex, without children, without companionship. Does that sound like your picture of a blessed life? Jeremiah was also sent to people who hated him, despised him, they mocked him, they threw him in prison. These very people who should have been weeping and thanking him for his faithful service to God. Instead, he was the one who was weeping over them all the time. At one point, maybe the lowest point of all of Jeremiah's 40 years of ministry, he was thrown into a dry cistern, which is like this well without any water in it, just a bunch of mud at the bottom. He spent days down there, nights down there, forgotten. Just an old man dying of hunger where no one could see him. Feet rotting, legs rotting. When someone finally pulled him out of there, days later, his legs were like twigs and his flesh was pale and putrid. Is that your picture of a blessed life? Maybe worst of all is that Jeremiah was ignored. He pleaded and preached to his brothers and sisters in Israel for 40 years. 40 years. He used vivid language. He used poetry. He even did stuff like wear a wooden oxen yoke over his shoulders for months at a time. Anything to get these people to listen to God's message to them. But you know what? In all of these pages, there's only recorded 2 people that ever listened to Jeremiah. Two. One was an Ethiopian eunuch named Ebed-Melech. The other one was me, his scribe, Baruch. 40 years and 2 converts. Does that add up to a blessed life? I haven't actually seen Jeremiah for years. He spent the end of his life in Egypt, where he was taken against his will. And that's where he died alone in a foreign country alone. Does that sound like the end to a blessed life? That question used to trouble me a lot. It really did. It bothered me. Why was God treating Jeremiah like this? Why had he let him down? Why had he let us down? But then Jeremiah wrote me a letter that made me ask an entirely different question. What do you want out of life anyways, Baruch? Actually, I've kept this letter for years, and I'm actually going to include it in this collection of Jeremiah's writings because this letter changed my life. Here's what he wrote to me. He said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says to you, Baruch." My own personal prophecy. We'd written tons of these prophecies before, but I'd never had my own personal one from Jeremiah. It really wasn't as exciting and great as I hoped it would be. He said, "You said in your heart, 'Woe to me! The Lord has added sorrow to my pain. I am worn out with groaning and find no rest.'" It's weird how God knows exactly what you're thinking. He knew my heart exactly. He knew what I really wanted. I wanted God's blessings. I wanted that prosperity, that easy living I thought Jeremiah was talking about in that other letter. And I thought that being close to Jeremiah was going to be my way to get all that. But God didn't want to let me just keep thinking that way. He didn't want that bitterness to just take over my heart when it didn't happen. So he had Jeremiah get blunt with me in this letter. Right after he says that, he says, "Don't seek such things." That's what he says right here. Don't seek them, Baruch. They're a dry cistern. They're a well that you're going to just keep drinking from, and you're never going to be satisfied. I really needed this letter. I needed this wake-up call from Jeremiah to get me realize that my entire life, which I thought was ministry toward God and toward my fellow Israelites, really what I was doing, I was running a race toward the wrong destination. And I'd never even realized it. I should have, though. I should have realized it a long time ago. You remember that? Here's the first letter that Jeremiah wrote to those exiles about the prosperity and all that. Right after he says that, if you go further on down the letter, what Jeremiah says is he quotes God saying, "You will seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all your heart." You will seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all your heart. My main problem, the reason that I was so miserable for all those years when I was with Jeremiah, is that I was not seeking God. What was I seeking? I was seeking the good, easy life. I was seeking God's blessings, His stuff. But I didn't really think that I needed God Himself. If He was part of it, great. But He was really not the central thing I was seeking for. But if Jeremiah's life shows anything, his legacy, his prophecies, but so much more just the way he lived his life, it shows that the blessed life is not necessarily the easy life. The blessed life is the one that doesn't necessarily have God's stuff. It's the one that has God Himself at the center of it. Because Jeremiah was a man who sought God with all of his heart, and he found Him. That is why here, at the end of his life, at the end of all his misery, I can say that he was truly blessed. So now I'm in the process of compiling all this stuff. I'm going to get it all neat. I'm going to put it in order. I'm going to add a little bit of history to the end. And then I'm going to make copies. I'm going to make a lot of copies. Because even though people may not have listened to Jeremiah during his lifetime, I know that God has spoken through these men. And just like his words have changed my life, I think they may have the power to change more lives in the future. In fact, I know that they will. Because even though Israel is in a very dark state right now, that will not be the case for all time. There are whispers and rumors in these very pages that dawn is coming. That even already the darkness is passing away and the light of the world, the true light, is drawing near. This is a poem that Jeremiah wrote that always fills me with hope. He's quoting the Lord. He says, "This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds, and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more." The people of Israel may not be seeking God right now, but God is seeking them.
Good morning. You know, we can't really begin to understand the exile unless we can somehow stand back and get the big picture. The simple picture is that Judah sinned against the covenant and God is punishing them just as he said he would if they persisted in sin. And it happens first to the northern division of Israel, the northern kingdom. You know, 722a, the first boot, 10 tribes carried away to Assyria. They're absorbed completely or scattered to points unknown, never to return. And now it's Judah's turn to get the boot, 586b. It's Babylon this time. Jeremiah tells us that nearly 5,000 prominent people are carted off, but really the total numbers end up far, far higher. But yet Jeremiah predicts the return in 70 years. This is part of the big picture that they need to see. And so we learn that a small number do return from Babylon, starting around 536, even though much greater numbers stay behind in Babylon. But let's say that you, think of yourself in this picture, you were living in 586, and maybe you're one of the Israelites in Judah who had not sinned by participating in the filthy idolatry of the evil kings. You had been true to God. You know, part of the faithful remnant we were talking about last week. What if you were Jeremiah? Let's get 3 of these prophets up here. Maybe you were Jeremiah and you ended up in Egypt because other people were stiff-necked, but you, for crying out loud, and of course you did some crying out loud, but you had been God's voice. How would it feel if you had been Daniel and his 3 friends, deported to Babylon in your youth, ended up in a blazing furnace in a pit with bone-crushing lions, but yet you had not ever been living in a way that would call for any judgment on you? And how would it feel to be Ezekiel? Really, same thing, a stand-up guy caught in the downdraft, no fault of his own, just caught in the crossfire of someone else's execution firing squad. How would that sit with you? I mean, I remember as a kid not exactly enjoying it when I got punished for somebody else's crime. Like the whole class had to stay in from recess because of 2 nitwits who kept goofing off during fractions. Or when we had to shoot 200 extra free throws and run extra stairs, this is Coach Kingsford, because we had missed so many free throws in the last basketball game. We, not including me who had been in the game but had never even been up to the line. And it's even worse if you get blamed for what someone else did and they get off scot-free. I remember several times when I got tagged with a charging foul when it was obvious that the defender did not have his feet planted. The ref just got it wrong. Okay, it's always easy to say it was someone else's fault. But anyway, but what if the referee is God? And he's supposed to know everything. And he certainly knows who has been true to him. He gave Elijah a number. 7,000 hadn't bowed to Baal or kissed his face. God knew precisely who deserved punishment and who didn't. And yet, here we are in 586, and good people are getting departed right along with the bad ones. And it's true, they are a minority, a remnant of those that are deported. But as God is dropping the hammer on his rebellious nation, good people are losing their homes and their farms and their freedoms and their families and every bit of life as they'd ever known it. Now, I'm saying that if we're going to get through confusion like that and not get bitter, it will take a firm grasp of the big picture. You've been there. Yeah, I mean, if not, you're the exception. Call it being exposed to what Ken Geyer called the north face of God. You've seen pictures of Mount Everest like this one. Well, this is the dark side, the north side, where the sun, in the northern hemisphere, the sun's on the other side of the mountain. And if this is the north face of God, this is the side of God where the sun doesn't shine, where the winds blow colder, where the shadows are blacker and the nights are longer. When God seems not remotely to notice you, how sincerely you trust him and love him, because bad stuff just keeps coming at you. And you feel exiled from God, like he's mad at you, but you don't know why. Your prayers are lamentations, pleading with God for explanations. My God, why have you forsaken me? Is this fair? Why do I get cliffs of suffering and only silence from you? Like rivers of blood and sobs innumerable, wetting the craggy cliffs, and you say nothing. God, do you of all people not care? Or in David's words, how long, O Lord, will you look on and do nothing? Where are you? And other people who seem far less committed to honoring God seem to get a pass on having a handicapped child or a weak heart or a bout with cancer or a blown knee or a lousy upbringing or a lack of resources. Say you grew up under a load of poverty through no fault of your own and you didn't have the privileges lots of other kids you knew enjoyed. And that's a ticket to the lonely halls of anger and bitterness. Lots of other things. You could end up with, just wrestling with fear and insecurity, or always second-guessing what the Bible says, or beating yourself up with self-condemnation, maybe eaten up with ugly jealousy, falling into the trap of trying to manipulate God to make sure he has every reason to bless you next time. Maybe last time you just weren't good enough, so now you're going to figure out how to be better. This is what happens to good people in exile who aren't aware of the big picture. There are 3 exilic prophets. We've seen their faces. The tail end of Jeremiah, who goes to Egypt, Ezekiel, who was taken in the middle deportation, and Daniel in the first. I want to focus on Daniel for a minute. The backstory is that he was one of the good Jewish boys caught in the crossfire. The Babylonians want a few handsome, talented kids to indoctrinate into their culture, first-round draft picks, top-notch guys. So Daniel and his buddies are ripped away from their families, life as they'd ever known it, and they are hauled off in the first deportation from Jerusalem. This is 605 BC. They're enrolled in a 3-year seminary program at the Chaldean School of Language and Literature with a minor in Chaldean cuisine. And on the first day of school, they get their lockers and they're assigned their new pagan names and a delicious menu that they can't eat. Well, not if they're going to stay Jewish. But you know, these guys had to wonder if they will get to be Jews anymore. Or even deeper, whether this means that they and their people, now being judged, will never have a special relationship with God again. They don't know it, but they are also being enrolled secretly in God's school of faithfulness under fire. I suppose the mascot would be a friendly lion. But anyway, we read ahead, we find out how they passed with flying colors. They got high honors, actually in both schools. They are the best thing that ever happened to Babylon. Remember, God designed his people to be a blessing to all nations. But here's the deal. These guys couldn't have known any of that. When the north wind swept them up and then swirled them away like fall leaves to a wretched place on the Euphrates, a pit of temptations, a place where faith was going to either be built or obliterated. Well, the big picture includes, I just say it's the north wind on the north face. The north wind blew this past Monday night. You probably felt it. The cold blast came from the Arctic wind chill in the single digits, not usual weather for us here in early November. It knocked out power for many of us. Raise your hand if you lost power. Do you have power back yet? All right, good. And a tree came crashing down right through the sunroom of one of our families in Gig Harbor. You had to look hard to find any good in this, but see, the big picture really included more than darkness and disaster. It also included ducks. On Monday night, Nate Corley and his wife Shauna are sleeping the night under a tarp in anticipation of an early morning hunt in eastern Washington. And my son Stephen and his wife Alyssa joined them in the blind in the frozen pre-dawn darkness, and the hunt was on. The ducks came. Man, did they come. They flew in on the cold, hard wind. The swept south at great speed from bitter Canada, swooping low for a chance at clear water. And they found it right in front of Nate and Stephen, who took their limit, took their picture, and took their wives to a warm car in time for a warm lunch. And Nate said, the best hunt ever. Thank the north wind. Later the same day, I hurried home from the office for a crack at the lawn, which had been growing a little too fast and had been getting covered with leaves. I cranked up the mower and headed to the back 40. It was sunny, it was cold, it was still windy. I leaned into the mower to get it done as fast as possible, and then I realized something I had never seen before. In the middle of leaf season, there were no leaves on the grass. After a windstorm, the lawn is usually blanketed with, yellow, red, and brown leaves. But the wind had come cruel and unrelenting from the opposite direction of our normal storms. And that north wind just stripped the trees, and they sent the leaves away from the grass into our backwoods. And so I thank the north wind for doing my raking. And I was really happy. Until I heard later about those outages, about the trees smashing through a home. The north wind is a curse or a blessing, depending on how big a picture you have. And if you get back far enough, you can see some of both. Well, we're going to learn from Daniel that the same sharp wind that brings you misery can also bring you ministry. That is the best thing for your soul. You think about Daniel, he could possibly see himself as a helpless little victim, a nice little spider minding his own business, caught between the gears of blind justice, and he could have shrugged his shoulders, tried to make the best of a pagan life. But God wouldn't let his soul hemorrhage like that, under the vain conclusion that God was stone cold toward him. That somehow God was thinking, oh, well, you can't please everybody. Because Daniel, he really wasn't caught at all. He was sent. And really, by the way, for that matter, so was King Nebuchadnezzar. In Jeremiah 25, God calls the king of Babylon his servant. It says this, because you, Judah, have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send for all the tribes of the north and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land. They will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Now, are you getting the big picture? God is in control. God controls the kings of the earth. Who rises? Who falls? And here's the key verse from Daniel, or at least a key verse, a couple of verses, Daniel 2:20 and 21. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. Now, these are words from Daniel. He is blessing God that he had given him the meaning of that huge statue, the dream of that Nebuchadnezzar king, who he didn't know what it meant, but now he wouldn't tell anybody the dream so that they couldn't fake an interpretation. And so here's Daniel and his friends. They're going to all get killed along with the rest of the astrologers for not being able to read all this stuff from the king's mind. Well, we learn that this is a succession of kingdoms. Now, here's a picture of the corner of our auditorium here, the end of the timeline. And if you've looked at the pictures over the top, it describes for you a series of kingdoms from Assyria to Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome. Well, this is exactly what this vision was. Here's this colossal image, and I'm putting it up here on the screen in the order, but on its side, so from top to bottom is now from left to right. The head, that's Babylonia and Nebuchadnezzar himself. Persia, Medo-Persia, so it's the gold head, it's the silver arms and chest, and then comes Greece, the torso with the thighs, and then comes Rome. Strong Rome, but not with the same quality of power that you would have from the king of Babylon, of course, who had the dream. But at the end of that whole vision or dream, all the kingdoms of man are pulverized. And God has his own story, worked out in advance until it all turns into a mountain of God's own glorious rule that will never be destroyed. That is the big picture that God gives to Daniel. Now, don't take this wrong, as if God is shuffling world powers without any regard for the faithful few. Because if you look at the context of these verses, this interpretation is how God saved four guys from being obliterated in this land. And if I look at this carefully and read it, I realize that Daniel and his friends are on their knees asking for help from God. And he gives them the big picture to save their lives because he cares about them, not just about kings and not just about kingdoms. And so that's why Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And so the verses that follow this are, God reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we, that is all four of us, were praying, asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. And so this is how God, with a cold north wind, swept this man Daniel and his friends into the White House. Daniel became the most trusted advisor of the most powerful man on this planet. He was there because he was, according to 620, the servant of the living God. Now, so here's what we have today from this. And there's a lot of ways you could apply this part of the history, but this is what I get from this that helps my soul, and this is why I love to read this part of the Bible. The big picture disciple sees his one small life as a significant piece of God's grand purpose, even if it takes adversity to get him into place. Now, maybe you're here, maybe you're not sure how your piece fits into God's great jigsaw puzzle, God's big picture, but you suspect from what you know from the Bible that God designed you the way you are for a reason. And even God put you on the slopes, those north slopes, for a reason. And sometimes you wonder, well, maybe it's just to help other climbers who are slipping, or to care about people who hurt just the way you hurt, but don't know what you know and don't know whom you know. Or maybe all you do is weep with those who weep, because you know what crying's about. I believe God gave us from the annals of this exile some tiny, encouraging portraits of big picture disciples, because a lot of us are those kinds of people. There are 5 of them I'm going to talk about: Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Nehemiah, and Esther. They are each in a place where they might have cared only about themselves. Some because of their wounds. You could just lick your wounds and ignore everyone else. Or some because of their privileged place. I've got it great, what's wrong with the rest of you guys? But see, they all had a bigger view, and so they all had a bigger heart. And they were people who did not deserve to be in exile, but they cared about the people who did. You can start with Jeremiah. This man could speak thunderous judgments on evildoers, but underneath was his heart. And what we're going to learn about him is that a big picture disciple weeps for the people still unsaved. Listen to these words from the prophet Jeremiah. The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. For the wound of the daughter of my people is my heart wounded. I mourn, and dismay has taken hold on me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then has the health of the daughter of my people not been restored? Oh, that my head were waters and my eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people. This is why Jeremiah was called the weeping prophet. He cries the tears that God's disobedient people should have been weeping for themselves. Turn to Ezekiel, the man who says that he was among the exiles by the Kebar Canal. Some of you guys that have been in Iraq, you might know that that's halfway between Baghdad and Basra. Anyway, from his lips and pen came mighty pictures of God's glory and wrath. He saw the big picture as clearly as anyone can. And that's why you read this in chapter 3, verse 15. And I came to the exiles in Tel Aviv who were dwelling by the Kebar Canal, which was the refugee camp there. And I sat where they sat, there where they were dwelling. And I sat there overwhelmed among them for 7 days. 7 days of silence, feeling what they were feeling before he ever spoke God's words. Sitting where they sit. God's first word came in mime in the silent presence of a grieving brother. Now Daniel. God has protected his servants from this furnace and from the lions, and he has in fact given them exalted positions. They were saved from the jagged edges of the exile because they ended up in the palace. And they could have just slapped themselves on the back and said, "Oh, what a good boy am I," and never given a thought for their own people. But not so, not for those who see the big picture. In Daniel 9, Daniel is remembering Jeremiah's prophecy that the exile will be 70 years, and the days for the returning to Jerusalem are approaching. But Daniel knows that they are in exile because of their sins, and he's concerned that they have not yet repented. And here's the touching thing, that Daniel doesn't put himself above the other exiles, even though, as far as we know, he had never been an idolater. But it says God assured him of the future while I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel. So let's see, one guy wept their tears, one guy felt their pains by being in their shoes, and now this guy confesses their sins as if they were his own. In fact, in the next chapter, he mourns over Israel for 3 weeks. The next big picture guy is Nehemiah. he's still in exile well after many people have returned to Judah. In fact, this is 90 years later. The year is 445. He serves as the cupbearer of the king of Persia. Things are not great over in Judah. Some guys come to Nehemiah from there, and they report to him how the remnant is, quote, in great trouble and shame. This is right at the beginning of the book of Nehemiah. They say the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and the gates are burned to the ground. And now from Nehemiah 1:4. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and thanked God I had stayed here in Persia, where I have a secure dwelling and an easy job in the palace. No. It says, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. He also humbly confesses his own sins, and out of this, he becomes the governor in charge of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. First, he prays. And so a big picture guy humbly prays, and then he makes himself available for any way that God would want to use him to put legs on the answer. The fifth picture, big picture guy in the exile is actually a woman. Her name is Esther. I don't have time to tell the whole story, but if you know the story, you remember that this Jewish girl won a beauty contest and becomes the queen of Persia. Really a fairy tale life, until evil Haman decides that all the Jews left in Persia need to die. She must take, as the story goes, she must take her life in her own hands in order to approach her husband, King Ahasuerus, in order to appeal for her people, the life of her people. And though this book never mentions God by name, you can certainly see his hand in all of this, as Mordecai, her uncle, certainly did. He said to her, chapter 4, verse 14, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And then she said, well, you know, if all the Jews will fast and pray, then I will go. If I perish, I perish. You see, a big picture disciple puts her life on the line for the sake of God's people. She is not caught. She is sent for such a time as this. All these servants saw that God was at work on something pretty grand, and so they were willing even to hurt and to suffer, to weep, to be available, to risk their life, whatever it took, because they had this sense that God has a big plan and I could be a part of it. Now, for the sake of the kids in our audience, I need to describe all of this in unmistakable practical terms. So here's the small picture. How a small picture guy acts. He cuts class to go fishing. Tells his mom it's an extra vacation day when it isn't. Okay, so that's where we start with this. Now, he doesn't really consider that there's a test on Friday, and he was supposed to be getting the clues to pass that test today when he's fishing. He hasn't got one brain cell working that's alert to getting a good grade on that test, how that can make the difference in passing the course, and that leads to a diploma that he just might need, much more important than a couple of baths on a leisurely afternoon. And that diploma opens the door to a job and a career, and then a family, and that he might not be able to support. And okay, so far so good, but that is not really what I mean by the big picture. You can say, okay, I'm an A student, so I must be a big picture person. Not at all. The big picture has to do with developing the character of doing the right thing when you're young, so it is your habit as you grow older. You do the right thing and you don't lie. The big picture has to do with God and what he might want to do with you as a fully equipped disciple who has honed your skills, applied your talents to small things so that God can entrust you with bigger things for his kingdom. Are you young people listening to me? Faithfulness is what you build from the time you are young. The big picture has to do with someday establishing a family that carries on a godly legacy for generations in the future, generations of people whose greatest joy is becoming like Jesus Christ for the sake of others. And by the way, I apologize to people who are planning to slide out of here early to see the second half of the Seahawks game. But the big picture means prioritizing big things over small things and doing small things faithfully as if they were big things, because the kingdom of God is the sum of small moves. And if you do that consistently for a lifetime, you're a big picture disciple who cares enough to weep for others, who humbly confesses sins, even those not his own, who risks his life or her life for others to live. And I wonder if that's the kind of person you want to be, because a big picture person, well, the big picture is a lost world out there that needs you. Now, one thing I know, people with the big picture are not consumed with how everything affects them. And even though you are living life on the north face, that can be the greatest place of all to minister. It certainly is the place where you often meet God in ways that you really need to. Does God know that you're there struggling on the cold north face in the frigid wind? Well, what do you really think? Ask someone like Johnny Erickson Tata. Ask others who have suffered, who have grown from that into a ministry they never could have had. Does God have some purpose that transcends your pain and even uses your pain? And I say I know that he does. I may not know. I can't tell you how. But you can trust him. In conclusion, I was thinking about a painting where characters in the landscape can't see each other in the painting, but you can see them from your artistic viewpoint. You're looking at it, your perch. If you go to Forest Lawn in Glendale, California, you can see a really big picture, about 200 feet long, a mural titled The Crucifixion. And you can see, I've circled the place where they are, but it's so big that that's just blurry in that area. But there's some shepherds in the distance to the left, and they're walking in the field with their sheep grazing. And they have no idea that the crucifixion of Jesus is taking place on the nearby hill called Golgotha. To them, it's just an ordinary day. They don't know that this is the greatest day ever. They don't know that this is the day when the Son of God is dying. And then the sky turns black at noon. They have to wonder why this is happening as they grope for their lambs and they curse the weather gods. They're caught in the unexpected, undeserved darkness, the north face, in a cold wind. And they don't know their sins are being carried by God's innocent lamb. Because they don't have the big picture. They don't even know Jesus is there in the darkness, their same darkness, experiencing as no one else ever has the north face of God. My God, why have you forsaken me? And they don't know Jesus at all, but Jesus, I was thinking about this, they don't see each other. Jesus, in fact, has his back toward the area where they are, but Jesus knows them. He is not suffering there thinking of his own pains. His miseries are his ministry. From that cross, he is praying forgiveness on his executioners. He is lovingly providing for his own mother. He is promising life to an undeserving thief because he's not there for himself. And he is trusting and obeying his Father in the day of his affliction. And imagine that God's lamb is saving the shepherds who share his darkness, even though for now they are lost in the well of their unknowing. Now, those tiny snapshots into the hearts of 5 exiles are nothing compared to the heart of this suffering servant, Jesus Christ. And there you go to look for what is always the center of God's big picture. It is a suffering Savior. And he says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and lowly of heart." Come to him. Let's pray. We thank you, Lord, for the loving way that you dealt with your people, even in times of judgment. How you even planned for the people of Judah who are being taken into exile that they would come back. Your wrath was only for a time. We know one thing that happened during that time is your people, with their noses pretty much rubbed in the idolatry of these pagan places where they were taken, they never, ever slipped into idolatry again once they came home. You had many purposes. But for us, you are telling us today that in all that big picture of the rolling by of century after century, things that we see in the timeline and then the succeeding centuries, even since Jesus came, this era that we call AD, that we also are part of your plan, each and every last one of us. For those that came here suffering and wondering if they have any place because they feel so broken, lift their hearts and let them see from you that they perhaps have a place in your plan as never before. We love your plan, and we love the heart that we see at the very middle of that plan, which is the heart of a suffering Savior. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.